Roman numeral 4, the eve of World War II. So this lecture is going to focus on really two things. The first part of the lecture, part 1, we'll be talking about American isolationism, the reasons for American isolationism, and then why we decide to, in part 2, start to go away from isolationism. At this time in American history, in Europe, war is on the horizon. Hitler has risen, as we'll talk about in these notes, Mussolini. It looks like Europe is headed to World War II, and the United States has to decide if they want to get involved in that war or not. And so we see on the front of this picture a political cartoon that's taking a reference to the Laocoon statue, and it says one person is saying help them, the other person is saying do nothing, and Uncle Sam is caught in the middle wrestling with the snake labeled isolationism. And so the United States is wrestling with this problem. Should we get involved in what's going on in Europe or not? Letter A, giving up on empire and tariffs. Number 1, America wants to let the Philippines go. If you remember back in the Spanish-American War, the United States got the Philippines because at that time America was looking for new markets, new conquests for its industry, and we were all about imperialism and getting land and markets and making America one of the leading nations of the world. But times have changed. Americans no longer want empire. And the first and primarily the most important reason is because of the Depression. In the 1930s, Americans don't need empire. They don't need more raw materials because they're not making as many things. They don't need markets because, well, we have markets at home that aren't buying anything. Americans feel that they have this sense that they just want to focus on their own problems. And so why are we having colonies halfway around the world? Next is that the taxpayers don't want to pay additional taxes. They're already struggling just to make ends meet, because if you have colonies, if you have empire, you have to protect those colonies, which means you need an army and you need a navy and you need to have an administrative system out in those colonies to make sure it runs. And so Americans think we don't need this expense. Why should we have more colonies? Next, labor unions. Labor unions, of course, don't want colonies either, because if we have colonies, then that allows those people to come to America, and they can provide cheap labor, which would be competition for labor unions. There's already a surplus of labor in the 1930s because of the Depression. And so in 1934, the United States passes an act called the Tydings-McDuffie Act. It promises the Philippines their independence in 12 years. In the past, we've talked about something like this. It said the Philippines could get their independence when they've proven that they're able to get their independence, that they can handle democracy. But now we're going to put a fixed date on it. In 12 years, you can have your independence. So this gives the Philippines a transition time to build up what they need to before they're on their own. Except the United States will keep a few key naval bases to protect the few possessions we do want to hold on to. And so we see the Tydings-McDuffie Act is an example of America's growing isolationism in the 1930s. Next, President FDR is going to continue Hoover's policy of the good neighbor policy, telling Latin Americans that we're not going to be involved in your business anymore. We have our own things to worry about. We have depression at home. Our businesses are struggling, so we don't need to have dollar diplomacy anymore. And so we see that FDR continues Hoover's policy of good neighbor ideas because of these reasons. But there's another reason, too. FDR sees that fascism is growing in Europe. We'll talk more about fascism later, but he doesn't want this new and what he considers very dangerous, because it is indeed a very dangerous type of government coming to the Western Hemisphere. And he thinks that if Latin American countries fear the United States, they will embrace fascist governments in Germany or in Italy as a way to keep the United States out of their business. So he doesn't want Latin American countries fearing us and turning to our enemies because they're afraid that we may come and invade them. So he assures Latin American countries with the good neighbor policy that we are not going to be a threat to you anymore, so don't go and embrace foreign powers. So, to that end, in 1933, the United States calls the 7th Pan American Conference, and here at this conference, the United States openly pledges U.S. non-intervention into Latin American political and economic affairs. Next, tariffs. So that's it for isolationism. Let's talk about tariffs. Now, if you remember, back when the Great Depression started, Hoover, he passes a tariff right off the bat. He thinks that that's going to force Americans to consume American goods, but in fact, it actually made the Depression worse. It makes it worse for the United States and for Europe with all this international trade not even going on at all. And so what we see is FDR decides that he's going to lift tariffs. he says that tariffs are bad for consumers. They may be good for industry, maybe, but they're certainly bad for consumers. And so he's going to lower tariffs. So we can compare this to kind of like a synthesis. We can compare it to Woodrow Wilson, another progressive who says that the government should benefit consumers, and FDR wants to do that. If you remember, Woodrow Wilson passed the Underwood tariff to lower tariffs, and so is FDR. He's going to lower tariffs again. So we have this thing called the Reciprocal Trade Agreement of 1934. It says to European nations, look, if you reduce your tariffs, we'll reduce our tariffs by as much as 50% of what they were before. He's hoping to get international trade going again, which would help our economy and some of our more friendly allies across the Atlantic Oceans, their economy too. And in fact, it does work. The United States will see a slight rise in U.S. exports, creating more manufacturing jobs in America. Next, capital letter B, American isolationism in the 1930s. So we're going to take a step outside of American history for just a minute, and we're going to look at what's going on in Europe and the other parts of the world, so you can understand how FDR's policy may or may not change over the course of his second term as far as dealing with other countries. So we have rise of dictators abroad. In Germany, we see the rise of Nazism and fascism and Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler is going to be using his control of Germany to slowly take different parts of Europe. We'll talk more about that later. Next, we have another fascist, Mussolini. He is going to take over control of Italy. And both of these governments are not pro-democracy. Fascism believes in having the government geared towards big business. It believes that the upper middle class and the rich should be firmly in control of things. It's not progressive. It certainly is anti-communist and anti-worker. And so we're going to see that these two leaders, Hitler and Mussolini, are going to use fascism to clamp down on their people's freedoms and put it firmly in the control of, have a marriage between big business and government to promote industry. Both of these regimes will pull of their countries out of the Great Depression just because they're going to be spending so much. They're going to be engaging in deficit spending, getting ready for World War II. Now we see full employment in Germany and approaching that in Italy as everybody's either involved in the army or they're in a factory producing weapons of war for the army. And so we see the Depression ends pretty quickly here in the 1930s for these fascist countries, but there certainly is going to be a cost for that to the rest of the world. Then in the Soviet Union, we're going to see the rise of Stalin. Joseph Stalin, he is a dictator in the Soviet Union. He also clamps down on personal freedoms. He also is going to start gearing up for World War II. And he is the natural enemy of the fascists. Communists, like the Soviet Union, they believe in power to the workers, in theory. The fascists believe in power to the businesses and the elite. And so these two kind of countries that are rising don't like each other, but they do have one thing in common. Both fascism and communism are going to be led by ruthless dictators. It will be a threat to the United States as we go through the 1930s. So, as this threat is rising in Europe, what does the United States want to do about it? Well, by far, most of the American people want to just put their hands in the sand and ignore what's going on in Europe. They have memories of what happened in World War I, which we'll talk about in a second, but America has its own problems. We figure, why should we get involved in what's going on in Europe when we have a depression and bread lines here in America? And so we don't want to get involved in the rest of the world. Next, during World War I, the United States banks had loaned Germany and France and England and a whole bunch of other countries millions and millions of dollars for the war, and those countries have not paid, all but one of those countries have not paid their money back to the United States. And so the United States says, well, what can we gain from getting involved in another war in Europe? We have our own problems here at home, the Depression, and we don't even want to loan countries that are going to get involved in war money because they're not going to pay us back anyway. Germany couldn't because they were in super hyperinflation before Hitler came along and the Nazis pulled Germany out of their depression, but Americans think that there's nothing to be gained by getting involved in Europe's affairs. And then, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, memories of World War I. The United States was promised by Woodrow Wilson, another Democratic president, that if we get involved in World War I, we're going to make the world a better place. That was that great progressive crusade. We're going to bring democracy to the world. We're going to end empire. And of course, none of those things happened, and so Americans have a very bitter taste in their mouth about getting involved in wars in Europe. It cost us money, it cost us American lives, we didn't make the world a better place, we have our own problems to worry about, and so the American public, by far, is isolationist. They want to stay away from anything going on in Europe. And then there's one other reason, too, one other major reason that Americans are isolationists, is there is this belief that World War I was just a war that was really, that was created by capitalists, to help capitalists, that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. There was this belief among the common people, kind of a conspiracy theory going on, that the capitalists of the United States pushed America into World War I so that they could get rich off the war. America needed all those submarines, and they needed all those battleships, and they needed all those tanks and bullets, and these manufacturers made just a ton of money while the common man went and fought and died in the fields of France. And so Americans are very angry at business anyway because of the Great Depression, and so they think that we're not going to get involved in a second world war in Europe just so that the rich could get richer again. And so for all of these reasons, we see America as isolationist. To that end, the people of the United States, there is a movement among the people of the United States to legislate isolationism, to ensure that it doesn't matter who's in the White House or in Congress, the United States will not get dragged into any other wars in the future. And so there is a movement among people to amend the Constitution so that the United States Congress can no longer declare war unless a couple of things happen first. One, if the United States is invaded, then that says that Congress has the power to declare war, or if the whole entire nation takes a vote on it, like a national referendum, where we let the people decide if they want war. Both of these things are very unlikely to let war happen. America probably won't be invaded, and national referendum, Americans are certainly not going to vote for war if they're given the choice. And so we see, now this constitutional amendment doesn't pass, but just the fact that it's a popular movement shows that Americans are certainly not in the mood for anything involving getting involved in other people's problems. So then we're going to go again back across the Atlantic, and we're going to talk about what's happening in Spain. We already talked about dictators on the rise in Germany and Italy and in the Soviet Union. Well, Spain is also having something going on. It's called the Spanish Civil War. It goes from 1936 to 1939, FDR's second term. And what happens here is that you have a democratically elected government of Spain, and they are being overthrown by a group of fascist rebels. Now, these rebels are not what you would consider your typical poor rebels that are trying to go up against a strong government. They are very well organized, and they are funded by Hitler and Mussolini. So they have modern weapons, they have all kinds of money that they're using to finance their revolution against the democratically elected government of Spain. And so we see that Spain says to the rest of the Western countries, look, if you're for democracy, you should go with the government that's in Spain and don't let these fascist rebels take over. And so FDR, he certainly understands the United States doesn't want to go to war, but he doesn't want to see a democratic government fall to fascism. He understands that fascism is indeed an evil thing. And so he thinks about doing something, think about what can I do when America's isolationist to help the democratically elected government of Spain. And so he has his famous quarantine speech. In 1937, he proposes in a speech that what the United States should do is we should quarantine anybody who's involved in this civil war, both sides. So he's not saying take part in the war. He is saying that the United States should help put a blockade or a quarantine around both sides in this war so the war doesn't spread. And if he does this, he knows that this will help the democratically elected government of Spain because they will be able to win the war without the rebels getting support from from the Nazis. If we put a kind of a blockade around Spain and let the Spanish just have it out amongst themselves, then that would keep the Germans and the Italians from sending aid in. And so he says to the American people, let's contain this war. Let's boycott the belligerents. Let's quarantine them so the war doesn't spread. But the American public is so much against getting involved in other people's problems that they won't even let the United States do this. They believe that if we say no, that nobody can get involved in the war in Spain, American troops are going to get put in harm's way trying to keep other people out from, keep the fascists from supplying Spain. And so the United States says, no, it's not our problem. If the fascists win the war in Spain, so be it. Now, some Americans are going to want to go and get involved in this war, and so we have the famous Lincoln Brigade, and it's a group of volunteers from America, and they go to Spain and they fight on the side of the democratic government. They lose. The fascists do take over Spain because they have the help of, like I said, this financial backing from the Italians and the Germans. But this is a great example of the Spanish Civil War telling us how isolationist Americans are at the time. We don't want to take part in this war, even if it's to block aid going in to a group of fascist rebels. And so the United States remains firmly isolationist. Next, outside of Europe, we see across the Pacific also more aggression. Now, Japan has been a monarchy for over 1,000 years, and so that hasn't changed. But the people who are underneath the emperor of Japan, they are very pro-military, pro-big business, just like what we see in Germany and Italy. And so we see that Japan is having economic struggles just like everybody else in the Depression, and the way they solve it is just like Germany, just like Italy, is they start to build up their military. This ends unemployment. It stimulates the economy, and so now Japan has this military. They want to use it, and Japan figures that if they have a military, they can go grab raw materials for themselves. They can create an empire, and Japan desperately needs these for their economy to continue getting better, because Japan is an island nation. They are lacking in coal, they are lacking in oil, they are lacking in tin and copper, all the things you need to industrialize, and so Japan decides that they're going to go and invade Manchuria, which is the northeastern part of China, kind of this dark rust color on this map, just above Korea. And so they invade Manchuria, and the Japanese were a little bit nervous about this because they thought, well, what will the world do if we're just, nakedly aggressive? We're just going to go out there and conquer parts of the world. Certainly the League of Nations will have something to say about this. But the League of Nations really doesn't do much. The League of Nations doesn't have any power. The United States is not in the League of Nations. Germany is not in the League of Nations. And the League of Nations doesn't have Article 10. And so England and France and the rest of the countries of the world, who are some of the leading countries, they are powerless to stop Japan. They decide they have their own depression going on. We're not going to go ahead and tell Japan who they can and can't invade. Now, what we do is we do kind of shake a finger at them and we say, don't do that. But Japan sees that nobody else is going to actually physically stop them, so that encourages them later on to think about invading the rest of China. And so we see their armies on the march in the 1930s, and nobody's willing to do anything about it for all of the reasons we've talked about before. Americans don't want to be isolationist. This goes so far as even to have Americans lose sailors, loss of life, and we don't do anything about it. There is a ship called the Panay. It's a U.S. ship in China, and the Japanese bomb and destroy the ship, killing American sailors. Now, normally, if we had maybe back in the time of Teddy Roosevelt, this may be declared a reason to declare war. The United States is so isolationist that we just tell the Japanese they have to apologize, and the Japanese kind of give us this lukewarm apology, and then that's it. We just go on. And so, again, here's another example of how when the United States doesn't do anything, even after our sailors are attacked in the Panay incident, that shows you how isolationist we are. So back to Europe. Now, I had told you that Hitler was in charge of Europe, and he's building up his military just like the Japanese are. And so we see in this map that Germany is this brown color, and then all the other areas around here, whether it's Austria or Western Czechoslovakia or something called the Rhineland that we see on the left, we see that Germany is going to incrementally start taking over chunks of Europe. Now, we don't need to go through the whole process for these notes, but suffice it to say that Germany is spreading its power across Central Europe. And this makes England nervous, and it makes France nervous, and it does make FDR nervous. FDR knows that the United States is going to have to get involved in this war eventually, in what's coming. He understands that whether it's Mussolini or the Japanese or Hitler, he understands these people will never be content to just have this land and then stop. And so he understands we need to get involved, but he knows America doesn't want to be involved. And so he's looking at this with a very nervous eye, what's going on in Europe. And so what happens is that we have all these invasions, and eventually England and France say enough is enough. And so they call Germany to the table, and the peace table, and say, okay, Germany, you're getting close to starting World War II here. You've got to stop all of these, conquering these little bits of pieces of countries in Europe. And they have this meeting in Munich, and so it's called the Munich Conference. At the meeting, Hitler says, he makes a promise to England and France. He says, look, if you just give me what is called the Sudetenland, which is western Czechoslovakia, we can see on this map, this green area. He says, ethnic Germans live there. I'm not trying to conquer the whole world. I'm just trying to unite Germans together under nationalism, under one country. I'll be content. And so England and France go ahead and decide to trust Hitler. They threaten Hitler that, any more movements you may cause war, but Hitler learned something at the Munich conference. He realizes that England and France are so afraid of World War II that they haven't recovered from the Great Depression, they haven't recovered from World War I, that he can pretty much do about anything he wants, and England and France are just going to back down. And so we call this the policy of appeasement. England and France engage in appeasement. They just keep backing off and letting Hitler, take another step and another step, and they keep saying to Hitler, don't do it again, and then he does it, and they say, don't do it again, and he does it, and they just keep backing off because England and France don't want to get involved in another war. And so Hitler wrote in his diary that after the Munich conference, he realizes that England and France are too weak. He thought that they might be powerful enough to stop him, but once he sees this policy of appeasement, where they just keep backing off, he realizes he has pretty much the green light for taking the rest of Europe. There's nobody that could really stop him. And so we see Dr. Seuss. Now, this is the first time we've talked about Dr. Seuss. Most of you know Dr. Seuss from his children's books, but before he wrote some of those, he was a political cartoonist, a satirist. And so he will write draw a whole series of cartoons that, it comes out as saying that he is against isolationism. So here we have, in the middle of this sea of monsters, we have this guy named the Appeaser. And he's got all these lollipops, right? And around him are all these monsters with swastikas on them, so obviously they represent Hitler. And we see up above, we see the Appeaser, England and France at the Munich conference, saying to Hitler, remember, one more lollipop and then you'll all go home, right? And these monsters, Hitler, say to them, yes, of course, we'll stop our attacks if you just let us have the Sudetenland, that's the lollipop, or Austria, or the Rhineland. And Hitler's, and so you see Dr. Seuss is making the point that appeasement doesn't work, that you can't trust Hitler. He is a greedy monster and he's going to try to keep gobbling up Europe. But England and France won't listen. So next we have something that will shock the world. We see the German-Soviet alliance. Now, in 1939, secretly, Hitler and Stalin, they exchanged a series of communications, and they agree to sign the Non-Aggression Pact. What this means is that Germany and the Soviet Union have publicly agreed that they will not attack each other, which is very shocking. They secretly met and they announced this to the world. This is very shocking because, like I said, communists are supposed to represent the common man, fascists are supposed to represent the elite. These two types of government hate each other. They're diametrically opposed. And so when they come out and they say we are not going to attack each other, this is really weird. It's such an odd pairing of countries who have said that they're not allies, but they're saying that we're not going to attack each other. And so that's what the whole world finds out about this non-aggression pact. So that's the public declaration. What the private agreement is that they don't tell everybody, is that Germany and Hitler both also agree that they will each invade Poland and that they will divide Poland in half. Now, why do they do this? Germany, they want a buffer zone between them and the Soviet Union. Hitler knows that England and France are pretty weak because of the appeasement thing, the Munich conference, and so he knows that they're not going to attack him anytime soon. And so what he wants to do is he's nervous about having England and France on one side of him, and Hitler's also nervous about having Russia on the other side, so he wants a buffer zone between him and Russia, and that's what Western Poland is going to be. And so now the Soviets, they also know that Hitler Hitler's a bad guy, and they know that someday they're going to go to war with Hitler, but they don't want it to be today. Russia is a large country with lots of people, but they don't have a lot of industry. And so Stalin needs time. He needs time to build up his army so that he can eventually fight the fascists when they do invade him. And so these two countries, they agreed to divide Poland because they each get something out of it. Germany is going to get a buffer state between them and the Soviets, and the Soviets are going to get time because both Germany and the Soviet Union have agreed not to attack each other in the anytime near future. That doesn't mean the distant future. And so we see that they are going to carve up, they're in the process of carving up Europe. And so in 1939, Germany invades Poland. And so we see that Russia also invades Eastern Poland too. And so we see the very private part of the Non-Aggression Pact become public. And this begins World War II. In 1939, when Germany invades Poland, England and France finally wake up to the realization that the Munich Conference was a farce, that you can't trust Hitler, amazingly enough, that he is not going to be content with a little bit of this and a little bit of that. His goal is to conquer the entire world, starting with Europe. And so England and France declare war on Germany in 1939. Now the Non-Aggression Pact now becomes really important for Germany, because now what they're going to be doing is just fighting a one-front war. Germany is going to face England and France together at the same time on the west, but since they have this buffer state on the east, Poland, they don't have to worry about also fighting the Soviet Union as well. And so we see Germany do a very smart thing here, at least militarily, in signing the Non-Aggression Pact. Everybody knows, like I said, in the future Germany and the Soviet Union will attack, but just not now. And so England and France are left fighting Germany on the Western Front all by themselves. So we see in 1939 is the start of World War II. Now Americans think of it as 1941 because that's when we get involved. But just like in World War I, Europe will be involved in the World War a few years before the United States gets involved because we're trying to be isolationist. So when we come back, we'll talk about part 2 of this lecture, American Isolationism Weakens. And the focus of part 2 is going to be about how FDR is able to convince Americans slowly that we need to get involved in what's going on in Europe, that we can't just sit back and say that's Europe's problems.